At the edge of Victoria Island, where the Atlantic wind combs the palms and glass towers glitter like cut ice, the Adeyemi mansion rose from the shoreline with a confidence that made chauffeurs whisper. Its perimeter lights traced a flawless rectangle around water, stone, and sky. Beyond the gates, a driveway of black granite curved toward a portico supported by columns that looked poured from moonlight. Cameras watched from discreet corners. Inside, silence traveled like a well-trained servant, carrying the scent of bergamot and waxed wood. The house had everything money could buy, and one thing money refused her. Daylight slid across the infinity pool like silk, then broke into diamonds as it spilled over the vanishing edge toward the sea. Glass elevators glided through the atrium with a hush that felt ritualistic, rising past suspended gardens and canvases signed in impatient strokes by artists whose names sold headlines. Marble staircases braided the levels together, white upon white, their veins recalling thunderclouds restrained. In the evenings, a steward arranged fresh suya and citrus water on a bronze console, while the city's horns murmured far away. Guests paused, listening, as if the house itself might inhale and answer at dusk. But the mansion's most exquisite feature was never on display. Behind a paneled corridor, past a sculpture that twisted like black fire, a set of soundproof glass doors hid a music room the staff had learned to clean by memory and fear. Curtains in sable velvet were drawn to defend the room from afternoon glare. A piano slept there, its lid closed like a guarded mouth. Housekeepers dusted the bench with feather-light strokes and retreated without lingering. Even the air felt instructed not to move. To mention the room aloud near the master was to invite winter into the hall. Obaoluwa Adeyemi moved through this realm like a tide, controlled and unassailable. In boardrooms he was a mathematician of risk, the elegant executioner of bad ideas, the storm that arrived in a tailored suit and left with signed term sheets cooling like rain on concrete. Tech founders sought his capital, ministers sought his discretion, rivals learned to respect the quiet. He had built data centers that pulsed like new hearts for the continent, and logistics corridors that stitched commerce to convenience. Yet the corridors of his home carried a more private story, one told in pauses and turned faces nightly. The staff spoke in codes when his shadow lengthened. "Clear the west gallery," someone would say, and hands would move, slippers whispering against marble. "Dim the skylight," another would add, and the ceiling would soften from noon to candle. They were well paid and well schooled, but fear has its own grammar, and the mansion had learned to speak it fluently. New recruits arrived impressed by the art and left impressed by the rules. Above all, the music room remained untouched, its key held in a secure drawer that only the master could open, and rarely did in those years. Visitors tried to be clever. At dinners, between plantain roses and peppered prawns, they asked why the home had no quartet, why the sound system never climbed above a tasteful whisper. Obaoluwa would smile with diplomatic warmth and redirect the conversation to satellite launches, to clean energy grids, to scholarships and seed funds. His voice was music enough for their ambition. After dessert, they wandered the corridors and discovered masterpieces that made them ache. Yet somewhere in the tour a tension gathered, like the feeling of a name forgotten. They sensed a missing note, and it kept echoing around them. In the servants' quarters, gossip braided itself into lullabies. Some said the piano had belonged to a patron who betrayed the master. Others claimed a maestro once visited and left a curse sealed beneath the keys. The oldest steward, who had served before the mansion was finished, said nothing at all, and it was the most persuasive story of all. Eniola's name had not yet been added to the duty roster, but the rumor of a new maid circled like a kite testing wind. The house waited for her without deciding why it needed to, as dusk approached the shoreline. At sunset, the facade burned rose gold, and shadows lengthened into the water like thoughts crossing an old memory. Obaoluwa stood sometimes at the balcony, not looking at the city but listening to it, calibrating which futures deserved his attention. To those who studied him, the silence appeared strategic. To those who loved him once, it was sanctuary. He wore grief like an invisible cufflink, perfectly matched, never mentioned. Staff learned to mark their steps to his mood. Florists learned which lilies to avoid. When night finally pressed its cool hand to the glass, the piano kept sleeping without dreams. The first sign of change arrived without announcement. Rain entered Banin with the theatrical confidence of August, unrolling its drums across roofs and lagoons. Generators hummed, lights steadied, and the corridors darkened to a pearly hush. Somewhere between the staff kitchen and the western gallery, a key turned where none should have. A draft breathed along the corridor, lifting the edges of framed photographs. Housekeepers paused, sensing a story crossing the threshold. At the end of the hallway, the glass to the music room showed a seam of darkness. The door, famously sealed, stood almost impossibly, open by a whisper. The taxi dropped her at the wrought iron gates where the mansion's security lights curved upward like vigilant eyes. Rainwater still glistened on the asphalt from an earlier shower, and the guards, dressed in fitted uniforms, barely raised their chins as they waved her through after confirming her name on the list. For Eniola, the simple act of stepping past those gates felt like trespassing into a myth. She had heard stories of billionaires' homes, but the Adeyemi mansion was not a home. It was a small nation wrapped in marble and glass, a realm unto itself. Her suitcase was modest, barely enough to clothe a week, but she held it with the dignity of a pilgrim. The moment the main doors opened, she gasped quietly. A chandelier swayed above her, its crystal arms scattering light into rivers across the polished floor. The ceiling soared with murals of skies, and beneath it, the silence pressed itself onto her shoulders like velvet. Staff hurried along the corridors in practiced rhythm, eyes cast down, movements disciplined. She thought for a moment she had walked into a cathedral of wealth, one where worship was measured in silence and obedience. Eniola had not always imagined herself in a maid's uniform. Back in Ibadan, before hardship stiffened her dreams, she had sat at the piano of her church and let her fingers fly into hymns that lifted worshippers. Her music teacher had once whispered that she carried more than talent, she carried soul. But poverty is a jealous master, and when her father's small business collapsed under debts and her mother fell sick, she abandoned the conservatory entrance exams and traded sheet music for shifts at a bakery. She learned quickly that passion does not fill empty stomachs. So, when a relative told her about an opening in Banin for a live-in maid at one of the wealthiest homes in Nigeria, she swallowed her pride and applied. This job, she told herself, was survival dressed in uniform. It would pay for her younger brother's school fees and buy medicine for her mother. She arrived prepared to scrub floors and polish glass, but she did not expect the mansion's silence to be the loudest thing about it. During her orientation, she noticed the mansion had no music playing anywhere, no soft jazz at breakfast, no gospel hum from the kitchen, not even the faint rhythm of television music, only silence. She asked another maid quietly why, and the woman gave her a sharp look. "Don't ever ask about that," the older maid said. "There is a door. A music hall. If you are wise, you will not even dust near it. No one touches the piano, ever." The words were delivered with such seriousness that Eniola almost laughed. Except, the older woman's eyes were not joking. The first few days passed in awe. She learned the routines, how breakfast trays were set with Swiss precision, how the curtains were drawn by exact hour, how the flowers were replaced before they wilted even slightly. She polished marble floors until her reflection looked back at her, ironed shirts that cost more than her entire wardrobe back home, and carried trays of champagne flutes into gatherings where she was invisible. She saw her employer, Obaoluwa Adeyemi, only from a distance, tall, controlled, always on a call, his suits whispering wealth. He walked as if the floor had been designed to anticipate his steps. Yet, even amid all the glitter, she noticed what was missing. A house like this should have had the heartbeat of music echoing from somewhere, string quartets during parties, a grand sound system pulsing during lonely nights. But there was nothing, only silence that followed her as she scrubbed staircases or arranged books in the vast library. Eniola carried music inside her even when the world tried to silence her. As she cleaned, she found herself humming softly old hymns her mother sang during hardship, fragments of melodies she once practiced on a worn-out upright piano in Ibadan. At first, she hushed herself, worried someone might hear, but soon she realized no one cared. The mansion's silence was too vast to be disturbed by a single human voice. Still, the warnings about the forbidden music hall grew heavier in her mind. She passed the corridor often, noticing how the air felt different there, cooler, stiller. She caught herself staring at the glass doors longer than necessary, wondering what kind of piano slept inside. She imagined its keys, their weight, their voice. Her fingers itched each time she walked by, as if her body remembered what her circumstances had forced her to forget. Obaoluwa ignored her, as he ignored most of the staff. His days were swallowed by meetings in his home office, conversations with men in Italian suits, and late-night drives in sleek cars that whispered out of the gates without warning. To him, Eniola was another uniformed presence in the background, part of the machinery that kept his empire of marble running smoothly. Yet she watched him sometimes, the way his shoulders carried invisible burdens, and wondered what kind of man buried his home in silence. One evening, as rain began to fall in sheets that blurred the windows, the mansion grew dimmer than usual. The sound of thunder rolled along the corridors, and power flickered before the generator restored it. Eniola had finished polishing the library floor and wandered toward the west wing, lost in thought. The storm outside pounded the glass like drums, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she walked. She turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the corridor, the glass doors to the music hall shimmered with droplets from a draft. The curtains inside moved slightly, as though disturbed. She blinked. The door that was supposed to be sealed, forbidden, locked, stood ajar, just wide enough for rain-cooled air to slip through. Her breath caught. The silence of the mansion seemed to lean in closer, waiting. The forbidden room was no longer just a rumor, it was calling her. The door sighed as she pressed it, swinging wider with a reluctant creak. A shiver ran through Eniola as she stepped into the room, her breath catching at the sight before her. The music hall stretched vast and solemn, lit dimly by the gray spill of rain through tall windows. The air was cooler here, dense with the perfume of wood, varnish, and the faint musk of years gone still. The silence felt alive, pressing into her chest, listening. Piano. It dominated everything black, polished to a quiet shine despite its years of neglect. Its curved body reflected the faint lightning flickers from outside, each streak of light sliding across its surface, like secrets trying to escape. The piano's lid was closed, as though it had sealed its voice under oath, yet its presence commanded the hall, the way a king commands a throne, undisturbed, absolute, unforgotten. Around the walls hung portraits, their frames gilded but dulled with dust. Eniola squinted at one closest to her. It was of a woman, elegant, graceful, eyes alive with laughter frozen mid-breath. Another portrait showed her seated at the same piano, her fingers poised above the keys, her smile radiant. Dust veiled the canvases, but even through the haze of neglect, Eniola could feel how beloved the woman must have been. A whisper of sorrow clung to the images, as if grief had seeped into the very paint. Eniola's heart raced. She knew she should turn back, close the door, and return to her duties. Every servant's warning pressed against her thoughts, urging retreat, but something stronger pulled her forward. Her palms tingled, her fingers flexed as though remembering without her consent. She hadn't touched a piano in years, but the muscle memory remained, coiled inside her like a dormant flame. Her mind carried her back to childhood. She saw herself again, barefoot in a small Ibadan church, sitting on a worn stool before an upright piano with chipped keys. The congregation would gather on Sundays, their voices raised in hymns. Eniola, the pastor's daughter's friend, had been allowed to touch the piano when services ended. She remembered the thrill of pressing a key, the sound trembling into the dusty air, fragile yet magnificent. Music had been her first taste of freedom, an escape from poverty, from hunger, from the unrelenting worry that shadowed her family. For a while, she dreamed of music school. She dreamed of becoming a pianist who would play across the world. But the world had other plans. School fees drained the family. Her father's debts dragged them down. Her mother's illness demanded every spare naira. Slowly, her piano dreams dissolved, replaced by survival. Yet now, in this mansion, in front of this forbidden instrument, that old hunger returned. It clawed at her, insistent, irresistible. She approached, trembling. The bench stood as if waiting for her. She sat, her knees weak, her breaths shallow. She placed her hands on her lap first, unwilling to touch too quickly. The silence grew heavier, almost accusing, as if the house itself knew she was trespassing. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer not for courage, but for permission. Her right hand lifted, hovering above the keys. One finger pressed down on a single note. The sound emerged soft, hollow, aching. It echoed across the hall like a ghost's whisper, startling her into stillness. She gasped. But the sound lingered, bouncing off the walls, daring her to continue. Her heart pounded wildly. She should stop. She should run. Instead, she pressed another key. then another. The sound began to string together into fragments of melody. At first, it was shaky, uncertain, like a child taking first steps, but as she allowed her fingers to move, the music began to breathe, trembling into life. The hall transformed, the air vibrating with each note. Her body remembered what her mind had nearly forgotten. Her fingers danced across the keys, coaxing out a hymn she hadn't played since childhood. The notes rose and fell, delicate yet insistent, as though they had been trapped in silence for too long and now spilled freely. Her eyes blurred with tears. The purity of the sound pierced her chest, uncoiling years of longing. For a moment, she was back in church, sunlight spilling through cracked windows, her friends singing around her. She was free again. The music swelled, no longer hesitant but powerful. It filled the mansion, like a river breaking through dry land, flooding rooms that had thirsted for it. The storm outside seemed to accompany her, thunder rolling softly in rhythm, lightning flickering in applause. The piano sang under her hands, releasing sorrow, joy, yearning, everything she had buried. She lost sense of time, lost sense of fear. She belonged to the music, and the music belonged to her. Each note was a prayer, a confession, a cry. The mansion had been silent too long. It needed this. She needed this. Then she froze. From beyond the hall came a sound that cut through her reverie. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing down the corridor. They struck like a drumbeat of authority, growing closer with each second. The sound of someone who did not rush, because the house already bent to his will. Eniola's blood ran cold. She looked at the door. It was too late. Whoever it was had already heard. The footsteps grew louder, measured, merciless. Obaoluwa Adeyemi was storming toward the forbidden room. The door slammed open with a force that rattled the chandelier above. Obaoluwa Adeyemi stood framed in the doorway, his tailored suit darkened by the storm's reflection, his eyes blazing with fury. For a moment, Eniola thought she would faint under the weight of that stare. She froze at the piano, her fingers trembling above the keys. But then something shifted. The music she had begun did not die in the air. Its lingering echo curled around the room, soft, haunting, insistent. And as Obaoluwa took a step inside, the fury etched into his jawline faltered, his breath hitched, his hands, clenched tight, opened just slightly. The melody pierced through his composure like an arrow. His shoulders quivered, as if the sound had found a weakness in the armor he carried daily. His eyes widened, not in anger, but in recognition. The hymn, simple yet profound, was not just music, it was memory. Eniola, caught between terror and instinct, pressed another key. The note lingered, fragile, yet alive. The billionaire's face contorted, his eyes glistening with something rare, something he had forbidden himself: grief. He staggered forward, one step, then another, as if pulled by invisible strings. Before the staff who had gathered behind him could process it, their master fell to his knees. The marble floor caught the sound of impact. Gasps rippled through the servants lined at the doorway. No one in the household had ever seen Obaoluwa Adeyemi, the titan of finance, the unshakable negotiator, the man whose decisions shifted economies reduced to this. The piano kept breathing under Eniola's trembling fingers. She did not even realize she was crying until warm tears streaked down her face, falling onto the keys. Something beyond her guided her hands now. Each note was an answer to his unspoken ache. Each chord was a bridge between the living and the lost. In his mind, time cracked open. Flashbacks rushed in, vivid and merciless. He saw her again, his late wife, Eniola, sitting at this very piano. She wore a silk gown that caught candlelight like water, her laughter filling the room as her fingers danced across the keys. She had been a brilliant pianist, a rising star who believed music could heal broken things. It was she who had chosen the piano, she who had filled the mansion with sound, she who had taught him that wealth was shallow without beauty. And then he saw the night it all ended, the accident, the phone call that shattered him, the unbearable stillness of the hospital ward. He had returned to the mansion alone, and the first thing he saw was this piano. He had locked it away that very night, unable to hear its voice without collapsing. The silence that followed had not been peace, it had been survival. Now, years later, here was this maid, this stranger, reviving the very melody that Eniola had played the night before she died. Every note mirrored hers, so precise it was as though she had been reborn in sound. His grief surged, unstoppable. He covered his face with his hands, sobs breaking free like thunder inside him. Behind him, the servants exchanged horrified glances. Their master, whom they had never seen bend, was undone by music pouring from a maid's hands. None dared speak. The storm outside roared in sympathy, lightning illuminating the room in fractured bursts. Eniola's chest heaved as she continued, her body trembling with the weight of what she was awakening. She wanted to stop, fear told her to, but her soul would not allow it. Something holy had opened between them, something larger than rules, larger than consequence. She played on, her tears dripping with every chord. Finally, Obaoluwa lowered his hands. His face was wet, his voice a whisper no one thought they would ever hear. He spoke a name, cracked and fragile, yet filled with devotion. Ifeoluwa. The name drifted across the room like a prayer, like a confession. The staff at the door gasped again, some covering their mouths. It had been years since anyone heard him utter his wife's name aloud. Eniola's fingers trembled as the final note of the hymn hovered in the air, fading slowly into silence. She sat frozen, her tears mixing with the sweat on her brow. She could feel his eyes on her. Heavy, searching, broken. Obaoluwa rose unsteadily to his feet, every breath labored as though he had just fought a battle with ghosts. He looked at her, not as a maid, not even as a stranger, but as someone who had just stolen the key to his hidden sorrow. His voice came rough, torn from deep within him. How? He took a step closer, his stare piercing her trembling form. How do you know that song? The storm growled outside, the servants shifted uneasily, and Eniola's heart thudded louder than the thunder. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Obaoluwa's eyes, dark with anguish and suspicion, fixed on her like a blade. Tell me, he demanded, voice low but sharp. Who taught you to play her song? Her lips trembled as she tried to form words. Obaoluwa's question hung heavy in the hall, sharp as lightning, demanding an answer she did not possess. She swallowed hard, her hand still resting on the piano keys as though the instrument itself might defend her. I don't know the song, she whispered at last, her voice fragile but steady. I swear, sir, it just came to me, from my heart. The room went still. The servants at the door leaned closer, waiting for the explosion they believed inevitable. But Obaoluwa did not shout. Instead, his eyes darkened with something far stranger than anger, fear, perhaps, or wonder. He shook his head slowly, as though refusing his own thoughts. No, he muttered under his breath. That melody, Ifeoluwa used to play it exactly like that. The same pauses, the same softness in the third chord. His voice broke, and he looked at Eniola as though she were a ghost in flesh. The silence between them thickened until it pressed against her chest. You will not touch this piano again, he said finally, his tone clipped and commanding. The sentence fell like a gavel, leaving her frozen in shame. He turned abruptly and walked out, his footsteps echoing like thunder retreating down the hall. Eniola sat there for a long moment, her hands limp in her lap. Her heart ached not just from fear of punishment, but from the weight of her gift. Her music had touched him, yes, but it had also wounded him. She had not meant to. Music was supposed to heal, not break. For days, the mansion returned to silence. She threw herself into chores, scrubbing floors and polishing glass until her arms ached, trying to bury the memory of his eyes on her. Yet at night, when the corridors grew empty and the storm of Banin traffic hushed beyond the walls, she found herself drifting back to the forbidden room. She would slip in quietly, close the door behind her, and let her fingers touch the keys. It was never grand sonatas she played, only fragments of hymns, whispers of lullabies, the kind of music that felt like a prayer. She thought she was alone, her only audience the rain tapping the windows. What she didn't know was that Obaoluwa, in his own quiet torment, often stood outside the doors, listening. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself he only wanted to confirm she wasn't inventing the melody from memory of his wife. But night after night he returned, leaning against the wall, letting her notes soften the corners of his grief. His chest would tighten, his throat burn, but he never stopped listening. The staff began to notice his strange behavior. The billionaire who once roamed the city at all hours now lingered in the mansion at night. He dismissed calls more often, his meetings shorter, his evenings less crowded with investors and ministers. Whispers filled the servants' quarters. Why is the Oga always in the West Wing? Why does he allow the new girl so much freedom? Some said he was bewitched. Others claimed she reminded him too much of the past. But no one could deny that the mansion itself was changing. The silence that once suffocated its halls now breathed with music. The air seemed lighter, the shadows less heavy. Even the staff worked with a touch more ease, their tasks accompanied by the distant hum of piano keys. Yet for Eniola, the change was not peace, it was conflict. Every time she played, she felt torn in two. Her heart soared finally. Music had returned to her. But fear gnawed at her. She knew her gift brought back something dangerous in the master. She saw it in his eyes that night. Saw how it broke him. Was her music a blessing or a curse? One afternoon, as she watered lilies in the courtyard, she sensed him watching her. When she looked up, Obaoluwa was standing by the balcony above, his hand resting on the rail. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before he turned away, disappearing inside. It was the first time she had caught him studying her, and it unsettled her deeply. The days stretched on, each one filled with music, silence, and stolen glances. Slowly, imperceptibly, Obaoluwa began to speak to her not orders, but questions. At first it was about music, where she had learned, what she liked to play, what hymns shaped her childhood. She answered shyly, never revealing how much she longed for the life she could not afford. Then the conversation stretched. He asked about her village, her family, her sacrifices. She asked nothing in return, but listened as he spoke, hesitant at first, then with surprising openness about his travels, his late wife's brilliance, and his own loneliness. The walls he had built around his heart began to show cracks, and she stood too close to them. One evening, as twilight painted the sky lavender and the mansion glowed with golden lamps, he appeared in the hallway where she was arranging flowers. His presence filled the space, and she dropped a petal in surprise when he spoke. "Eniola," he said, his voice low, careful, almost tender. "Join me in the private lounge for dinner tonight." Her hands froze around the vase. The words struck her harder than any reprimand could. No servant had ever been invited into that sanctuary. It was where he met dignitaries, where he entertained billionaires, where he kept the world at arm's length. She turned slowly, her breath caught between terror and awe. "Me? Sir?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Yes, you." The staff, watching from a distance, nearly dropped their trays. The mansion itself seemed to pause, stunned. Eniola's heart thundered. A door far more dangerous than the music hall had just opened. The private lounge glowed like dusk bottled in crystal, amber light breathing over smoked glass, and the hush of an expensive playlist left intentionally off. A single table waited beside floor-to-ceiling windows, the lagoon outside pulsing with city reflections. When Eniola entered, her steps almost vanished into the rug's thick hush. Obaoluwa rose, not as a master greeting staff, but as a man stepping toward a precipice. "Sit," he said gently, then steadied his hands on the chair back. "Your music, it heals me." The admission startled the room itself. A bell rung in a cathedral of silence. He took his seat, exhaling, as if surrendering a weapon he had carried too long. "When you play," he continued, voice low, "something opens and something closes. I feel haunted, like I'm walking back through corridors I sealed, but I also feel alive for the first time in years. It's wrong to need it, perhaps, but I do." Steam from pepper soup curled upward, carrying ginger and memory. Eniola held her gaze on the bowl, unsure where to place her eyes, afraid to meet his fully. They began clumsily, like strangers relearning language. He asked about her family, and she spoke of Ibadan mornings where the generator coughed awake before dawn, of a mother who stretched stew with water and prayer, of a younger brother whose notebooks smelled of rain and ambition. She confessed the humiliation of talent with no tuition, the betrayal of being gifted by God and abandoned by circumstance. As she spoke, the room softened. The billionaire ceased to be headline and legend, becoming only a listener whose breath slowed to her story's tempo. When he answered, it was with grief braided to gratitude. He told her about Obaoluwa's audacity, the way she'd play Bach at breakfast, then high life at noon, then invent a lullaby at midnight because the night felt lonely. He admitted he'd learned power from numbers but learned love from her impatience with silence. Then he confessed the emptiness after the accident, the way he reorganized his calendar until living became a scheduled task, the way he locked the piano and kept walking so he wouldn't fall. Between courses, their confessions traded places like dancers swapping lead. She described choir rehearsals, the yellowed hymnals, the sticky heat of August Sundays, the aching delight of a chord resolving. He spoke of conferences that applauded him while he felt unseen, of investors who mistook precision for peace. With each exchange, the boundary between master and maid grew porous, like glass warmed by breath. Eniola noticed details she had missed before: the carefulness with which he handled cutlery, the way he said please to the server, the fatigue hiding in immaculate posture. After dessert, he led the conversation into a chamber where few had been allowed. "Most people ask me for access," he said, turning the glass in his fingers, watching the light break. "They want introductions, investment, endorsement. You brought me the one thing I cannot buy." He met her eyes then. She felt it like heat. "I will not pretend this is simple. But I want you to know I trust you to be honest, to tell me when silence becomes a wound again." She nodded, frightened by the privilege, moved by the weight of it. Trust spilled beyond the lounge in the days that followed. He invited her to morning debriefs where he sifted through headlines and macro charts, explaining how a rumor could tilt currencies and a whisper could move markets. He asked her what she heard in a founder's voice during a pitch, what her instinct said about sincerity. She answered carefully at first, then with intuitive confidence that surprised him. In the evenings, he took his calls on the terrace while her music floated from the hall, and afterward they would discuss not just tempo and phrasing, but also patience, regret, forgiveness. The servants noticed before the city did. The chef began plating an extra course for the West Wing. Housekeepers found fresh lilies in the music room, changed before their scent soured. In the staff kitchen, rumors simmered beside boiling kettles. He smiles now. She eats in the lounge. Maybe she's family. Family how? The question trailed like perfume. Some eyes hardened with envy, others softened with complicated hope. They watched Eniola polish vases with her headphones off, present in a world that kept inviting her deeper. But invitation carved new tunnels for guilt. At night, when she lay in the linen-soft guest room he'd reassigned her, Eniola measured the distance between gratitude and temptation. She replayed the moment his voice cracked, the way he said heals, and wondered whether her gift had become medicine she had no right to administer. In the mirror, she examined a face that belonged to hand-me-down dresses and careful budgets, then pictured the wife whose portrait still kept the music room company. She feared she was borrowing light that didn't belong to her name. He wrestled privately too, an athlete of restraint, using every disciplined muscle not to sprint toward the relief she offered. In the gym at dawn, he counted reps against the beat of conscience. Loyalty, loyalty, loyalty. In the shower's steam, memory fogged and cleared laughter at the piano bench, a kiss in the hallway, a silence that lasted years. He questioned the ethics of joy, interrogated the arithmetic of grief. Was love a finite resource divided among seasons, or could it expand like capital invested well? The answer refused spreadsheets and returned to melody. One evening, he poured palm wine and confessed what he feared most. "I don't want to replace her," he said, staring at the glass as if it might translate him. "I only want to replace the silence." Eniola understood. "Music doesn't replace," she replied softly. "It reveals. Sometimes it reveals the wound, sometimes it reveals the healing. You are allowed both." Her words steadied him like a hand at his back. He felt a permission he hadn't earned, a benediction he hadn't expected, and it humbled him from the inside out. Their nearness became a rumor even in rooms without people. His voice gentled when he said her name. Her steps found his cadence without trying. During meetings, he would glance toward the corridor, as if listening for a distant scale, then return to negotiations with a patience that startled rivals. In the music hall, she played less for herself and more like a conversation addressed through wood and wire. This is what sorrow sounds like mending. This is what forgiveness sounds like walking home. The first evening breeze of Harmattan slipped in early, carrying dust and a hint of distance. By then, the house had adjusted to its new climate of sound, and the staff had learned to move through it reverently. That was the day the jet returned from London, its tires kissing Murtala Muhammad's runway like an omen. News traveled faster than luggage. Adeyemi had landed immaculate, decisive, the partner whose counsel once steadied empires. She entered the mansion with the eye of a strategist and the smile of a woman who remembered being indispensable, paused at the west wing, and noticed that the silence was gone. Adeyemi arrived like a well-cut blade, gleaming, precise, impossible to ignore. Her heels measured the marble, announcing a rhythm that pulled eyes from any task. She wore smoke-gray silk that caught light reluctantly, and a smile sharp enough to part curtains of respect. Finding Eniola arranging lilies in the west corridor, she paused as though studying an exhibit. "So," she said, voice lacquered with courtesy, "you are the melody haunting this house." Her gaze grazed the uniform, then settled on hands that had learned the piano by hunger. "Good afternoon, Ma," Eniola said, steadying the vase. The flowers trembled, though her hands did not. "I only clean and sometimes play when asked." The other woman's brow arched. "By whom?" Eniola inhaled the lily's green scent and let the question pass. Adeyemi's laugh was quiet, practiced. "Know your place," she said softly, as if offering advice. "Because a song wanders through them. Whatever stories the staff trade, remember, access is not identity." Her perfume lingered like old money in doors that never opened fully. Eniola felt the words slice, then chose where to bleed. Nowhere visible. "Yes, Ma," she said. But her tone carried sand, polite. Unyielding. "I know my place. On the bench when music is needed. In the corridor when work calls. In prayer when courage runs thin." A flicker, almost amusement, crossed Adeyemi's face. How devout. Be devout to discretion, too. She stepped closer, testing for tremor. None appeared. The vase stood composed, lilies unspilled. The air conditioning breathed like a discreet audience. The corridor held its breath for the next movement. In meetings that week, Obaoluwa's attention tilted toward the west wing. When Eniola entered with tea, his voice warmed by a degree the board could not quantify. Adeyemi noticed. She had spent years reading the texture of his focus, the way it wrapped a room like a tailored coat. Now that coat sometimes slipped from her shoulders to cover the maid. She countered with brilliance, flawless slides, crisp forecasts, a reminder she had steered acquisitions through storms. He praised her work, yet his eyes drifted toward the corridor where silence lived. Jealousy in Adeyemi did not hiss, it calculated. She began to stage encounters that placed Eniola under glass. Requests to refill water during a founder's pitch, a comment about fingerprints on crystal that were never there, a reminder of protocol delivered with velvet accuracy. "Stand a little farther back," she murmured during a tasting, "so the investors can see the screen." The staff heard the politeness. They felt the blade. Eniola learned to receive each note with composure, then escaped to the piano where judgments could not follow. Only listen. Music became her counter-argument. In the afternoons, when the sun burned white against the lagoon, she practiced, with the door half open, letting scales climb the corridor like ivy. The notes were not defiant so much as undeniable. Staff paused, straightened their backs, and moved with a rhythm that made chores feel less like penance. Even the chef salted more generously when arpeggios glittered from the west wing. Adeyemi passed sometimes, pausing without pausing, her reflection split by the glass. Eniola kept playing, refusing a duel she could never win on the battlefield of pedigree. The mansion turned into a chessboard no one acknowledged. Moves were made with flowers and calendars. Adeyemi arranged a brunch for visiting moguls on the terrace at the exact hour Eniola usually practiced, then suggested background music from a curated playlist. Obaoluwa listened politely, then said, "Let the house breathe today," which everyone understood to mean, "allow the piano." Later, he asked Eniola's opinion on a philanthropic initiative, while Adeyemi watched, expression unaltered, nails immaculate. The staff looked away because gossip prefers witnesses who claim blindness. In the staff quarters, loyalties organized themselves like quiet political parties. Some rooted for the maid who played like prayer, seeing in her a victory for anyone who had ever been told to hush. Others feared scandal, counting salaries against the risk of displeasure. The head steward, veteran of 1,000 wealthy tempests, advised neutrality and polished silver with philosophical vigor. "Storms pass," he said, "and so do blue skies. Keep the table level." Yet even he stood nearer the west wing lately, as if balance needed melody. Adesewa's counterstroke matured into spectacle. She orchestrated a salon evening for Banin high society, couture, canapés, an exhibition of a newly acquired sculpture in the East Gallery. Her invitations traveled like gold leaves, landing only where influence pollinated. A celebration of modern taste, the card promised. She planned a program flawless enough to make whispers obedient. At the walkthrough, she suggested hiring a renowned violinist to perform a selection more appropriate for guests than improvisations. The pause was gentle, lethal. Eniola heard about it and practiced until her wrists ached, then practiced more. The afternoon before the salon, stormlight silvered the windows. Obaoluwa entered as Eniola traced a tender progression and stood beside the piano as if visiting a grave that had learned to sing. "They will come tonight," he said, eyes on the keys, "to observe taste." He looked up. "Let them witness truth." She read the cost in his gaze and the courage beneath it. In the hall, footsteps gathered. In the city, drivers rehearsed valet routes. He stepped back and, for all to hear, announced a private gala in the mansion Eniola would play. The mansion awoke to spectacle. Chandeliers blazed brighter than constellations, and silk drapes cascaded like rivers of dusk. Along the driveway, a fleet of black cars glided in rhythm, each door spilling out, Banin powerful and glamorous, senators with wives in sequins, tech founders with watches that told 2 time zones, celebrities whose laughter announced itself before they did. Photographers were kept at the gates, flashes strobing the night as if the sky itself had joined the party. Inside, servers in crisp uniforms wove through the halls with trays that glittered champagne, jollof canapés, plantain cups crowned with caviar. The air smelled of jasmine and ambition. Guests drifted into the atrium, marveling at sculptures and debating stock indices, their conversations a chorus of wealth. Tonight, Obaoluwa Adeyemi had turned his home into a stage of influence, but the true performance had yet to begin, and whispers pulsed beneath the laughter. Why music, after all these years? And who was this mysterious pianist the invitation hinted at? Then came Adesewa. She descended the grand staircase in a gown of molten gold, sequins catching, light like fireflies trapped in glass. Her entrance was rehearsed, perfection, each step a proclamation, each glance a calculation. Guests leaned in with admiration, recalling her years as Obaoluwa's right hand in business. She smiled with authority, dispensing greetings as if the evening belonged to her, yet behind her eyes glimmered a sharper purpose. Tonight, she would reclaim her position, even if it meant dimming the newcomer's fragile glow. In a smaller corner of the house, Eniola stood before a mirror. The staff had found her a gown not extravagant, but elegant, navy silk that flowed like midnight waves. Her braids were pinned simply, her face bare except for a touch of lip gloss. She felt like a child sneaking into a masquerade where the masks were carved from power itself. Her hands trembled as she clutched the hem of her dress. When the steward came to fetch her, she whispered a prayer under her breath, one her mother used to sing, "Let me not be ashamed when I put my trust in you." The guests gathered in the music hall, its glass doors thrown open for the first time in years. The grand piano gleamed under spotlights, polished to a black mirror. Murmurs spread so the rumors were true. The forbidden room was alive again. Adesewa positioned herself near the front, her smile flawless, her eyes sharp, watching. Then Eniola entered. The hall hushed. She walked slowly, every step echoing in the silence. She was not adorned like the others, no jewels, no diamonds, no designer labels screaming for attention. Yet there was something undeniable about her simplicity, something that drew eyes. She bowed her head respectfully, then sat at the piano. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling. She heard the weight of every gaze, felt the storm of judgment before it struck. For a moment, fear nearly silenced her. Then she remembered the first hymn she ever played, the way her little brother had smiled despite hunger, the way her mother's sick body had leaned, back against the sound, as if resting on hope. Her breath steadied. She pressed the first note. It rang out raw, haunting, beautiful. The hall froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Her fingers moved, hesitant at first, then finding courage, weaving a melody both tender and commanding. The piano spoke through her, its voice rising like something resurrected. Each chord shimmered, aching yet alive, filling the room with emotions money could not buy. Obaoluwa stood at the edge of the hall, his face illuminated by the music. For the first time in years, he did not mask himself. Guests saw his eyes glisten, his posture soften, his entire being surrender to the sound. The sight stunned them. The titan of industry, the man who silenced rivals with a glance, was undone by the hands of a maid. Adeyemi clenched her jaw. She waited for a chance, then rose gracefully as the final note faded. With practiced ease, she approached the piano. "Beautiful," she said, her voice slicing the hush. "And now, perhaps, something more professional." She signaled for the violinist she had arranged in secret to step forward, but the sabotage backfired. The violinist played perfectly, yet the performance felt rehearsed, bloodless, safe. After Eniola's raw honesty, it was like tasting water after wine. The guests clapped politely but turned back toward the piano, their eyes drawn to the girl who had played not for applause but for truth. Whispers erupted, slipping through the hall like wildfire. A maid? A lover? Why does she play his wife's piano? Look at the way he watches her. Some smiled knowingly. Others frowned. Scandal already forming on their tongues. The gala ended in applause for Eniola, applause that startled her, applause she tried not to believe. Adeyemi's gown glittered still, but her light felt borrowed now, strained against the quiet power of music. She stood beside Obaoluwa, but his eyes were elsewhere, drawn again and again to the girl at the piano. By dawn, Banin woke to headlines. The billionaire and the mystery pianist. Who is the maid who stole Adeyemi's silence? Paparazzi shots showed Obaoluwa leaning forward during Eniola's performance, his gaze unmistakable. Rumors spilled onto radio shows, WhatsApp groups, gossip blogs. The question was no longer about music. It was about love, scandal, and the unthinkable possibility that a maid had become the heart of a billionaire's world. By morning, Banin had tuned itself to a single frequency: gossip. In salons and traffic jams, on balconies and in corner offices, the city hummed with the same refrain: the billionaire and the maid. Screens bloomed with headlines, talk shows threaded innuendo through laughter, and voice notes flew like swallows from group chat to group chat. A radio host asked if romance could cross class without spectacle. A blogger answered with a slideshow of Eniola at the piano, pausing on the frame where Obaoluwa's gaze looked like surrender. The mansion's gates held firm, but rumor needed no gate pass. In conference rooms high above the lagoon, the cost of beauty was tabulated. Board members arrived early, faces tightened by prudence. Shareholders who never attended suddenly discovered their calendars clear. They spoke of reputational risk, of brand fragility, of markets allergic to scandal. "We respect your grief," one said carefully. But the optics. Another slid a chart across the table showing sentiment curves dipping since dawn. It was a language Obaoluwa knew: numbers, risk, timing. Yet somewhere behind the data pulsed the memory of a melody that refused to be amortized. Adeyemi moved through the day with the elegance of inevitability. She did not sling mud, she served narrative. An exclusive whisper here, a carefully phrased comment there. She's very persuasive, in her way, offered to a journalist who owed her 3 favors. On television, a friend of a friend, coiffed and credible, wondered aloud if certain employees cultivated proximity to power through artful performances. Every sentence wore perfume and gloves. Nowhere did her fingerprints show, yet the portrait sharpened. Eniola as seductress, the billionaire as enthralled. The internet did what it always does, multiplied cruelty. Memes crowned Eniola princess of polishing and pianos. Threads compared her dress to the price of a single chair in the mansion. Someone dug up a blurry photo from her church youth choir and captioned it like a punchline. She became a spectacle in markets too, vendors nudging each other as a girl who resembled her haggled for tomatoes. Offline, a woman at a salon declared that love across class is a fairy tale with an invoice. Behind doors, a few softened. They remembered a song that visited them once and did not charge. Within the mansion, the storm found its echo. The staff moved more quietly, as if sound itself might be cited as evidence. The chef reduced salt, the gardeners clipped more carefully, The stewards learned to notice windows that framed the west wing, then look away. Eniola wore her uniform like armor, and her silence like prayer. She kept to corridors, eyes on lists, spine straight. When she passed a mirror, she practiced neutrality until she believed it, then failed the moment she heard a melody in her head and had to swallow it. Pressure arrived dressed in reason. Advisors asked for a pause, a cooling-off period, they called it, during which Eniola might be reassigned, ideally to a property without cameras waiting at the gate. For the good of the whole, someone murmured. Meaning the empire. Data centers, logistics corridors, the scholarship fund whose launch was scheduled for next week. The suggestion hung in the air like humidity. Everyone pretended the decision would be administrative, not moral, he answered without ceremony. At a foundation luncheon, microphones arranged like flowers, he deviated from the script. A nation invests in talent wherever it finds it, he said, eyes steady, voice unhurried. Sometimes that talent is wrapped in privilege, sometimes it is wrapped in humility. In my home, after many years, music returned. I am grateful to the musician. The room held its breath. PR hands twitched under tables. A donor's smile stiffened. A young volunteer looked as if she had witnessed lightning touch ground. The clip traveled through the city faster than any denial could. The backlash sharpened. A minister postponed a meeting. A bank requested clarifications. Two partners suggested more seasoned leadership at the next acquisition committee, a phrase that meant less human, more predictable. The line between ally and bystander redrew itself in real time. A few called privately, their voices hushed by loyalty. Stand, one said. Storms end. Another warned with affection disguised as threat. The wrong people are enjoying this. He thanked them all and turned off his phone. That evening, Eniola found the piano room empty and the lid closed as if in prayer. She stood beside it, palms flat against cool lacquer, and listened to the ache beneath her ribs. Leaving would be simplest: slip out, find a room in a quieter neighborhood, send her salary home, and learn to hum without keys. But music had changed shape inside her. It was no longer an escape, it had become a vow. She feared the harm her presence might cause him. She feared the harm her absence might cause his healing. Between those fears, the only unafraid thing was a chord waiting to be struck. For the first time, she went to him. In the study, skyline pouring through glass, he stood with his jacket off, tie loosened, sleeves folded like a truce. She spoke before courage could expire. If my leaving will steady your world, say it. I will pack tonight. He looked at her as if measuring the distance between gratitude and surrender. If you leave, he said slowly, let it be, because your dream calls, not because their noise commands. The room felt lighter for a heartbeat. Then the phone on his desk vibrated like a trapped insect. He didn't answer. The screen flooded again, messages stacking, banners crawling. When the third vibration came, he picked up with a reluctance that already knew. The voice on the line was controlled, urgent, familiar enough to call him by his first name without apology. Words arranged themselves into a new weather: leaks, documents, projections, private valuations, signed term sheets uploaded, anonymous handle, screenshots already circulating. For a long second he said nothing. Silence gathered every fragile thing in the room and held it tight. Who? He asked finally, voice flat, almost gentle, like a surgeon asking where it hurts. The answer was a name he would have defended yesterday, a close aide who owned keys to too many doors. On the screen, a notification slid across like a dagger dressed as light, a trending thread parsing confidential deals line by line, complete with dates and the careful malice of someone who had always known where to aim. He set the phone down as though it could bruise the desk. Outside, the lagoon shrugged under city lights. Inside, the air thinned. Eniola stepped nearer without speaking. Somewhere in the house, a clock practiced patience. He lifted his eyes at last, and the man who had chosen melody over optics drew a breath that sounded like a prelude ending. Someone inside, he said, not to her, not even to himself, but to the truth now sitting between them. A betrayal. The notification chimed again, brighter than thunder. Confidential business, once sealed like a vault, was out in the street, and the storm they had prepared for was not the one now walking up the steps. The name lingered like ash on Obaoluwa's tongue. He sat in the study long after the call ended, his body heavy with disbelief. The man accused, Kunle Ajayi, was not just an aide. He had been a protege, a younger brother in all but blood. Obaoluwa had taken him from obscurity, mentored him through late nights of spreadsheets and strategy, trusted him with passwords and confidences. To learn that Kunle had leaked deals, working in secret with Adesewa, was not just betrayal, it was desecration. Documents began to surface in the financial press, each leak more damaging than the last. Forecasts warped, valuations questioned, partnerships hesitated. A logistics deal meant to expand into East Africa stalled. Investors suddenly spooked by instability at the top. Stock in one of his listed ventures dipped, algorithms translating gossip into numbers. The empire he had built on discipline and foresight trembled, not because of market forces, but because of treachery inside his own walls. The sting was sharper because it was personal. He remembered Kunle's first suit, too large, borrowed for a pitch. He remembered lending him cufflinks for a gala, watching pride lift the young man's chin. He remembered defending him to skeptical board members, insisting loyalty mattered as much as talent. And now this. Sabotage, disguised as ambition, his trust weaponized. Exhaustion seeped into Obaoluwa's bones. Nights became longer, his meals untouched, his eyes bloodshot from parsing reports that felt like confessions. For the first time, he considered retreat. Let the empire shrink. Let others fight the wars of image and optics. Hadn't he done enough? The thought of stepping back crept closer, tempting him with the idea of silence, not the silence of grief, but the silence of release. Eniola found him there, hunched in the West Lounge, his tie loose, the skyline reflecting off untouched whiskey. She sat across from him, waiting until he lifted his eyes. "You look like a man who has forgotten who he is," she said softly. He gave a hollow laugh. "Perhaps I never knew." Her gaze did not flinch. "You built roads out of nothing but vision. You turned ideas into companies that feed thousands of families. You mentored men who had no chance until you gave them one, even Kunle. If you step back now, you let betrayal become your legacy instead of resilience." Her words landed heavier than the accusations, because they were true. He studied her, the humility of her dress, the steadiness of her voice, the way her hands lay folded as if offering strength. In her, he found not pity but partnership. The maid who had once trembled before the piano now steadied the billionaire, unraveling before her. They began to talk late into nights, not about love, not yet, but about rebuilding. She asked questions no advisor had dared. Who gains when you fall? Where is trust still unbroken? What does your empire look like without its disguises? He listened, surprised at how her simplicity cut through the noise. Together, they charted paths, restructuring boards, doubling down on philanthropy, investing in transparency. She became his sounding board, her clarity anchoring his storm. But beyond strategy, something deeper grew. When his voice broke while speaking of Eniola, she reached across the space between them and touched his hand, not as a servant comforting a master, but as a woman steadying a man. He did not pull away. That night, in silence, a truth crystallized. She was no longer just his comfort, she was becoming his strength. Eniola, however, carried her own private battles. Alone in her room, she paced under moonlight, hands pressed to her chest. Love was creeping into her heart, undeniable, dangerous. She feared it as much as she cherished it. What if he broke under grief again? What if she was only a substitute for what he had lost? She prayed for wisdom, her whispered pleas weaving with the sound of distant waves. Yet every morning, when she saw him, the fear bent to tenderness. Their bond did not escape notice. Servants carried tales in careful whispers. Investors began speculating, wondering if the rumors of intimacy were true. And Adesewa, ever calculating, studied the shift with sharpened eyes. She knew Obaoluwa's guilt was his weakness, the loyalty to a wife gone, the fear of betraying memory. She crafted her strategy with precision. Frame Eniola not only as scandal but as obstruction. The wedge that could cost him contracts, allies, legitimacy. The moment came during a high-stakes dinner with international partners. Adesewa arrived dazzling, her words dripping with poise. Over dessert, she released her trap, speaking of recent distractions clouding leadership, of loyalties torn between past grief and present indulgence. The words were vague enough to be denied, sharp enough to strike. All eyes turned to Obaoluwa. He felt the weight of choice pressing against him like stone, reputation or love. To affirm Eniola publicly meant risking deals, risking years of labor. To distance himself meant betraying the very music that had pulled him back to life. As the room waited, Eniola sat in the corner, summoned only to assist but now thrust into judgment she never sought. Her heart pounded. Would he deny her? Would he retreat into silence to save his empire? Adesewa's smile curved, certain she had cornered him. But in Obaoluwa's chest, two wars collided, one of loyalty to the dead and one of devotion to the living. The next word from his mouth would decide which future survived. Silence stretched across the dining room like a taut string, ready to sing or snap. Then Obaoluwa stood, the linen glinting white against his dark suit, and made a choice that changed the weather in every room that would ever hold his name. "I love her," he said simply, as if stating a market fact. No metaphor, no apology. Conversations dropped dead on silverware. He did not look at the partners first. He looked at Eniola, whose hands had gone cold around an untouched carafe. "You are not a distraction," he told her. "You are the reason the silence ended." The room exhaled, then inhaled gossip, then braced for impact. Adesewa's composure did not crack. It refined. "Oba," she began, velvet over iron. "You risk everything for a feeling that—" He faced her. The history between them gathered in his eyes. "Enough," he said. Not cruelly, but with finality. "You have confused guardianship with governance. You serve the empire. You do not own my heart." She held his gaze a beat longer, then smiled the smile of a strategist who had just met a variable outside the model. Around them, partners shifted, recalculating. The dinner ended courteously, as grand endings often do, and every handshake arrived bearing terms that would be revised by morning. The market answered at dawn. Shares dipped in the company most closely associated with his name. Analysts spoke like meteorologists predicting a storm. A supplier deferred a shipment. A global fund pressed pause. On the group chat of directors, silence did more talking than words. One by one, shareholders announced temporary recalibrations. A concerto of cautions played in the key of capital. He listened, eyes dry, voice even, as if taking a recital of symptoms before prescribing a future. Pain did not deter him. It clarified. But the erosion hurt, because it named who would hold his hand in fair weather only. Eniola suffered harder. In the staff corridor, she told him the sentence that love offers when it is most afraid. "Let me go," she whispered. "Take back what you said. I will disappear and the city will forget me. And your world will steady." He gathered the words gently and put them where they could not break things. "No," he answered. "If I lose the world while keeping you, I have traded up." She shook her head, tears bright with blame. "I didn't come here to cost you your life's work." "You came to return my life," he said. "The work can be remade." They went public, not with a press release but with a walk. One evening, under a sky the color of guava peel. They crossed the marble terrace together, her hand in the crook of his arm. A visiting journalist's camera found them. The photograph traveled without permission. The billionaire and the maid, not as rumor but as posture, unhidden. The city split like a chorus in two parts. Some sang admiration, love daring class, music, daring money. Others sang outrage hierarchies offended, traditions tested. On talk shows, pundits debated legacy. At bukas, women argued between sips of zobo. In churches, prayers muttered for wisdom no one could quantify. They retreated into a rhythm that made sense. The day's battles in numbers and nuance, the evening's healing at the piano. In the music hall, he sat on the rug while she played, her notes the language their souls learned before birth. Sometimes he closed his eyes and swore he heard Ifiolua blessing them from within the resonance itself. Sometimes he opened them and saw only the living girl who held the future steady with both hands. They spoke in low voices between songs about fear, about loyalty, about the possibility that love could honor the dead by refusing to die. Outside, Banin practiced its verdicts. A designer sent a dress for the brave pianist. An influencer called Eniola an opportunist and gained followers. An elderly neighbor sent a tub of homemade chin-chin with a note that read only, "For strength." In boardrooms, a coalition of the cautious formed. "We need steadier optics," one director insisted. "We need steadier hearts," another replied, and resigned. The empire trembled, but it did not collapse, because its foundation had never been applause. It had been discipline. And discipline, when taught by grief and tutored by music, survives longer than noise. With the immediate fires contained by calm, he began to redraw the map. "No more companies that require me to appear invulnerable," he told his team. "No more strategies that demand silence as proof of toggles. Competence." He consolidated holdings into fewer, stronger entities with transparent governance. He elevated a younger, principled COO known more for integrity than swagger. He relocated certain negotiations from the ballroom to the community hall, where scholarships were signed beside smiling parents. "We build in daylight now," he told Eniola. "If they wish to trust me, let them trust the work they can see." At night, plans met tenderness. He cooked for her once awkwardly, earnestly plantain a shade too soft, eggs spiced like ambition. They ate on the balcony while the lagoon pretended to be a mirror. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "I know," he said, brushing a thumb across her wrist. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's loving louder." She played afterward, a new melody she didn't recognize, as if the piano had been composing them in secret. When the last note fell away, they rested in a silence that, for the first time, felt like breath rather than burial. The mansion learned their happiness like a new language. Staff moved gentler, the chef salted boldly again. The gardeners trimmed bougainvillea into hearts no one claimed responsibility for. Even Adesewa, watching from a distance calculated by dignity, adjusted her strategy. Less assault, more inevitability. "They will tire," she told a confidant. "The world will insist on its old shape." But the old shape no longer fit his hands, and then the night came that forced everything into flame. It began with a flicker, just a blink in the chandelier as the city coughed under humid heat. PHCN faltered. The generator surged. A hum rose through the walls like a swallowed shout. In the west wing, a socket sighed where it should have held firm. Eniola sat at the piano, coaxing a lullaby toward sleep, when the lights stuttered again, and a smell threaded the air sharp, electric, wrong. She lifted her hands from the keys. Somewhere behind the paneling, a spark looked for company, and found dry insulation eager to agree. The room went gold at the edges. A line of flame licked along the baseboard as if signing its name. Eniola stood, heart sprinting, and turned toward the corridor to call for help, just as the first curtain caught, inhaled, and bloomed. The fire moved like a predator set free. At first it slithered beneath the woodwork, teasing edges, tracing patterns across paneling as though rehearsing. Then it roared, devouring curtain after curtain, climbing walls until the music hall glowed like a furnace disguised in velvet. Smoke thickened, curling through the air with the bitterness of burning silk. Chandeliers cracked, their crystals raining down like shattered stars. Shouts erupted in the corridor. Staff scrambled. Alarms shrieked. The mansion, once a sanctuary of silence, became a theater of chaos. Eniola stood frozen at the piano bench, her heart beating faster than the flames that circled the room. She should have fled with the others, but her eyes clung to the instrument, the black lacquer, the keys gleaming even as smoke stained them. This was no ordinary piano. It was the bridge between her and Obaoluwa, the vessel of her dream, the voice of a woman she had never known but whose presence she had resurrected through melody. She stepped closer, coughing, her hand reaching as if to save a friend. "I cannot leave you here," she thought, "not to ashes." Her fingers brushed the lid just as the fire snapped forward, a beast lunging. Heat singed her skin. Panic surged, yet she pulled at the bench, as though dragging it might somehow deliver the piano itself. A timber beam groaned above, sparks cascading like furious rain. For a moment, it felt as if she would be swallowed whole by the room's collapse. Then, through smoke, a silhouette broke the haze. "Eniola!" Obaoluwa's voice was raw, stripped of all composure. He charged forward, coat raised against flame, his hand seizing hers with desperate force. She resisted, pointing at the piano. "It's still here, we can." But the ceiling cracked, a roar echoing as if the house itself had made its final verdict. Wood splintered, embers rained. He pulled her against him, dragging her away from the bench as the instrument shuddered beneath a falling beam. The sound it made, a final dissonant crash of broken strings, rang through the inferno like a funeral song. The piano was gone. He half carried her through the hall, shielding her from debris, their bodies slammed by heat and falling plaster. The corridor blurred with smoke and screams, footsteps scattering toward exits. They stumbled, gasping, until the main doors burst open and cool night air poured over them like salvation. Outside, the garden glowed with emergency lights. Staff huddled in ash-streaked clusters, eyes wide as their master and the maid stumbled out together, clinging to each other as though tethered by fate itself. They collapsed on the lawn, lungs dragging in air. Ash covered them, smeared across cheeks, caught in hair, blackening their clothes. Around them, the mansion's windows cracked and exploded, fire illuminating the night sky in violent orange. Sirens wailed from a distance, rushing closer, but in that moment Obaoluwa heard nothing but the ragged sound of her breathing against his chest. His arms wrapped around her tighter, not from fear of losing her to flame, but from the realization that he never wanted to lose her again to anything. For the first time in years, he did not feel the ghost of Eniola pressing against his ribs. The piano that had been her shrine was gone, its ashes scattering into the Banin night. And strangely, he felt lighter, as if grief itself had burned with it, leaving behind not absence, but room for something new. He lifted Eniola's face, streaked with soot, her eyes shimmering despite the chaos. "You are my song now," he whispered. His lips pressed against her forehead, sealing words into vow. She wept, not from fear, but from relief that music had not betrayed her, that love had not abandoned her, that she had been pulled from fire by the very man she had feared to love. "Then let us build again," she whispered back. "A new life, a new music, together." And in the shadow of the burning mansion, amid smoke and ruin, they made a promise no flame could consume. Weeks passed. The city buzzed with stories, headlines weaving myth out of survival. The billionaire and the maid who survived fire. From scandal to salvation. The love song of Adeyemi. Some mocked, some admired, but none could ignore. In meetings, partners leaned forward again, not with the old arrogance, but with wary respect. An empire shaken was not an empire broken. Slowly, contracts returned, trust rekindled, reputation tempered by resilience. Then came the unveiling. On a sunlit afternoon, the gates opened to reveal the new Adeyemi residence, not as ostentatious as before, but luminous with intent. Glass walls framed gardens of bougainvillea, water features whispered peace instead of excess, and in the heart of the home stood a music room, not hidden this time, but open, waiting. In it rested a piano, sleek, ebony, reborn. Eniola sat before it in a gown of soft ivory. Her fingers touched the keys with reverence, then pressed, releasing a melody both tender and triumphant. The room filled, not with echoes of ghosts, but with the sound of survival transformed into art. Obaoluwa stood beside her, not as master or mogul, but as man, his eyes drinking in every note. Around them, the staff, the allies who remained, even skeptics watched, hushed by the clarity of music that needed no defense. Her playing was different now. It carried the weight of fire, the truth of love, the freedom of choosing joy after grief. Every chord testified, we lived, we endured, we begin again. When the final note trembled into silence, the house did not feel haunted. It felt alive. Outside, Banin carried on markets, bustling, horns blaring, voices debating. But beneath it all, whispers spread like wind. About a billionaire who had chosen love over optics. About a maid whose music had resurrected not just a man but an empire. They called it scandal. They called it madness. They called it legend. But for Obaoluwa and Eniola, seated at the piano together, it was simply the final melody, the one that proved music conquers grief and love bends even wealth into surrender. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Hit the like button and share it so more people can feel this journey. Subscribe now and join our growing family for more emotional billionaire dramas. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Eniola's place?